Well, the company Navigator withdrawing its petition in Iowa to build a carbon capture pipeline. ADM says it's staying the course, and pipeline opponents are now suing to block the Summit Carbon's water permit. There was a lot of news on the carbon pipeline front this week, but viewers also have questions. That's customer support.
Pipeline opponent Dan Tronchetti questions different kinds of emissions. The IRFA research paper that claimed we needed CO2 pipelines to save the ethanol industry was a flawed piece of work. Were you aware there are two kinds of CO2, biogenic and anthropogenic? The EPA does not track biogenic CO2 because it is part of the natural carbon cycle and is considered carbon neutral. Anthropogenic CO2 is produced when fossil fuels are burned, such as coal to generate electricity. Fermentation at an ethanol plant produces biogenic CO2. Capturing the biogenic CO2 will not lower the carbon intensity score of an ethanol plant. The only way to lower the carbon intensity score of an ethanol plant is for them to reduce their anthropogenic CO2. Carbon footprints are defined as, for a product, its carbon footprint includes the emissions for the entire life cycle, from the production along the supply chain to its final consumption and disposal. That's from Wikipedia, and it pretty much matches other sources closely. There are not different kinds of CO2. There are different sources. Biogenic CO2 is mostly fermentation emissions, which are theoretically matched by carbon consumed by photosynthesis of the corn plant and balance out. But consider this basic example. An ethanol plant releases both anthropogenic and biogenic CO2, indeed twice as much biogenic, but CO2 is CO2. If you reduce either one, you reduce the footprint or total emissions. CCS, carbon capture and storage, reduce emissions of CO2 regardless of where it comes from. It turns out fermentation emissions are not just larger, but are also easier to capture. So even if biogenic CO2 is already matched by plant recapture, reducing them reduces the ethanol footprint. The Renewable Fuels Association, the head cheerleader for ethanol, shows this reduction in admittedly fine print on the life cycle analysis. Capturing fermentation CO2 reduces the footprint 25 to 30 grams per megajoule. It is an important selling point for the RFA when comparing to fossil fuel footprints. Since plants can't magically identify or consume only biogenic molecules, if CCS is used on fermentation emissions, equal anthropogenic CO2 will then be absorbed by the plants instead.
Thanks, John. When we come back, this isn't your average grilled cheese. It's the world's largest. So how did two Wisconsin brothers at only 10 and 11 years old accomplish that cheesy, massive feat? That answer's next.